The jungle had its own voice, a constant mix of rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the low hum of insects. Darren was used to it. He had spent weeks exploring this wild, untouched island, mapping its terrain, collecting samples, and documenting its strange ecosystem. But tonight, something was different. A scream. Sharp. Desperate. Human? No, not quite. Darren froze mid-step, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his survival knife. He wasn't alone out here. The firelight flickered through the trees up ahead, and the rhythmic pounding of drums sent vibrations through the earth beneath his boots. He crouched low, his heart pounding. Carefully, he moved toward the source of the sound, his boots barely making a sound on the damp soil. The closer he got, the clearer the voices became, guttural, chanting in an unfamiliar language. Then he saw them. A group of humanoid aliens, their bodies painted in crude markings, surrounded a roaring fire. Their muscular forms moved in synchronized motions, some gripping sharpened spears, others raising their arms in ritualistic gestures. But at the center of it all, bound by thick vines and forced onto her knees, was someone unlike any of them. Her skin was pale blue, smooth and almost luminescent in the firelight. Her long silver hair was tangled and matted with dirt, but even in this state, it had a strange, otherworldly beauty. Large, violet eyes darted wildly, filled with fear as she struggled against her restraints. She wasn't one of them. Darren's chest tightened. He had never seen an alien like her before. The tribes on this island were primitive, aggressive, and territorial, but she was different. Everything about her, from the delicate shape of her face to the soft curves of her body, was unlike the hardened warriors surrounding her. One of the tribal aliens, a towering figure with jagged scars across his chest, stepped forward and lifted a dagger high into the air. The girl's breathing quickened, her struggles becoming frantic. The chants grew louder, the spears lifted higher. Darren didn't hesitate. He moved before he could think, slipping through the foliage with practiced ease. His hand tightened around his knife as he sprang forward, kicking over a stack of dried wood near the fire. Sparks exploded into the air, and the flames roared higher. The sudden chaos startled the aliens. Their chanting faltered as they turned toward the disturbance, their yellow eyes narrowing. Darren didn't stop. He lunged toward the bound girl, slicing through the vines in one swift motion. She gasped as her arms came free, her gaze snapping to him in shock. "Run!" he barked. She hesitated for only a second before scrambling to her feet. But the moment was too short. The tribe had recovered from their shock, and now they were angry. A spear whizzed past Darren's head, narrowly missing him. Another warrior lunged at him with a bone knife, and he barely had time to duck before slamming the hilt of his blade into the attacker's jaw. The girl grabbed his wrist, pulling him. "This way." Her voice was soft yet urgent, filled with desperation. There was no time to argue. They ran, crashing through the jungle, the shouts of the tribe following close behind. The drumming continued, louder now, faster, fueling the chase. Darren's lungs burned, his muscles screaming, but he pushed forward. He had no idea where they were running, no idea who this girl was, but one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let her die here. Branches whipped past Darren's face as he sprinted through the dense jungle, his breath coming in sharp, measured exhales. The alien girl clung to his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. Behind them, the guttural roars of the tribal aliens grew louder, their heavy footfalls pounding against the damp earth. "They're fast," Darren muttered under his breath, his survival instincts kicking in. He wasn't just running blindly, he was scanning, calculating. The jungle was dense, full of hidden paths and natural obstacles. He needed to use the terrain to his advantage. A spear whizzed through the air, narrowly missing them before embedding itself into a tree. The alien girl flinched, but she didn't slow down. "Keep moving," Darren urged. She nodded, though she was clearly struggling. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the ground, but her breathing was ragged. She wasn't built for this kind of escape, not like the warriors behind them. Darren took a sharp turn, pulling her with him. They burst through a thicket of vines and stumbled into a steep downward slope. Without hesitation, he grabbed her waist and yanked her close as they slid down, dirt and leaves kicking up around them. They landed hard at the bottom, Darren rolling onto his side with a grunt. The girl tumbled beside him, gasping. He scrambled up first, scanning the area. A river. Fast-moving, deep. Dangerous. Perfect. He turned to the girl. Can you swim? She hesitated, her violet eyes flickering with uncertainty. I think so. Then let's go. No more time to think. He grabbed her hand and jumped. The cold water hit them like a wall, pulling them under instantly. The current was strong, dragging them forward as if the jungle itself was trying to swallow them whole. Darren fought against it, keeping his grip tight on the girl's wrist as they surfaced. "Hold on to me!" he shouted over the roaring water. She obeyed, wrapping her arms around his neck, her body pressing against his. He ignored the unexpected warmth of her skin against his own and focused on staying afloat. The river carried them far, sweeping them past jagged rocks and fallen trees. The shouts of the tribal aliens faded into the distance, drowned by the rush of water. After what felt like forever, the current finally slowed. Darren kicked his legs, guiding them toward the shore. His muscles burned with exhaustion, but he pushed through, dragging both of them onto the muddy bank. The girl coughed, her chest rising and falling in quick breath. Darren collapsed beside her, staring up at the dark sky through the gaps in the trees. Silence. For the first time since the chase began, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the gentle lap of water against the shore. We lost them," the girl whispered, her voice shaking. Darren let out a breathless chuckle. "Yeah. For now." She turned her head to look at him, her silver hair sticking to her damp skin. "You saved me." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he really took her in. Her delicate features, the way her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dark, the way her lips parted slightly as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Something stirred in his chest. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated, then whispered, "Sci-Fi." "Sci-Fi." It was beautiful. "I'm Darren." He offered a tired smile. "You all right, Sci-Fi?" She nodded, but her eyes still held the weight of fear. They would have killed me." His jaw tightened. "Yeah. But they won't. Not while I'm around." She stared at him for a moment, then, before he could react, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Darren stiffened, caught off guard by the sudden closeness. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to anyone holding on to him like this. But after a moment, he relaxed. His arms wrapped around her, holding her close. "We're safe for now," he murmured. "Let's find somewhere to rest. Then you can tell me everything." Sci-Fi pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Okay." Her voice was soft, but there was something else in it now. Trust. And for the first time in a long time, Darren felt something he hadn't in years. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The jungle around them was eerily silent now, the danger fading into the distance with the rushing river. Darren's body ached, his muscles burning from the escape, but he couldn't stop yet. He scanned the dark trees, his instincts still sharp. They needed shelter. Sci-Fi clung to his side, her breath uneven, her violet eyes darting around as if expecting the tribal aliens to reappear at any moment. She was shaking, whether from fear or exhaustion, he wasn't sure. Darren gently squeezed her arm. "Come on. We need to keep moving." She nodded, though her steps were unsteady. He guided her away from the river, deeper into the thick foliage. The ground was damp beneath their feet, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and distant flowers. After a few minutes, he spotted what he was looking for, an overhang of rock nestled between the roots of an enormous tree. It wasn't much, but it would keep them hidden and dry. "Here," he said, motioning for her to sit. We'll rest here for a bit. Sci-Fi hesitated before sinking onto the soft ground, pulling her knees to her chest. Her silver hair was still damp, strands clinging to her face. Darren knelt beside her, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The quiet between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only exhaustion in its place. After a moment, Sci-Fi spoke, her voice soft. You're human. Darren chuckled, leaning back against the rock. Yeah. That obvious. She managed a small smile, but it faded quickly. I thought I was alone. Her fingers traced patterns in the dirt. I didn't know anyone else was here. Darren frowned. How did you end up in this mess? Who were those guys? She swallowed hard, hugging her arms around herself. They call themselves the Alari. They're not from my world, but they've lived here for generations. They don't trust outsiders. She looked down. I crash-landed here a few weeks ago. My ship was damaged, and I was trying to find a way to fix it, but they found me first. Darren's jaw tightened. And they were just going to kill you? She gave a small nod. They see me as a threat. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. Damn. Sci-Fi glanced up at him. What about you? Why are you here? Darren leaned his head back against the rock, staring at the dark canopy above. I'm part of a research team. I was. We were studying the ecosystem here. Plants, animals, weird stuff you don't see anywhere else. But then my team left. The ship took off without me. He smirked bitterly. Guess I wasn't important enough to wait for. Her eyes widened. They abandoned you? Looks like it. He shrugged, though the memory still stung. Figured I'd make the best of it. Been surviving ever since. Sci-Fi was quiet for a moment, then, in a whisper, she said, I know what that feels like. Darren looked at her. The way she hugged herself, the sadness in her voice, it wasn't just about the Alari. There was something deeper there. She turned to him suddenly, her violet eyes searching his face. Why did you save me? The question caught him off guard. He could have walked away, ignored the screams, and stayed safe in the shadows. But the truth was, the moment he saw her, bound, terrified, and alone, he hadn't hesitated. Because you needed help, he said simply. She stared at him as if she wasn't sure how to respond. Then, slowly, her lips curved into the smallest, most fragile smile. A sudden breeze swept through the jungle, and Sci-Fi shivered. Without thinking, Darren pulled off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened at first, but then her fingers clutched the fabric, pulling it closer. It's warm, she murmured. He smirked. Yeah, well, humans have their uses. She let out a soft laugh, and for the first time, she didn't look quite as afraid. Darren exhaled, relaxing slightly. They had survived the night, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The Alari would keep searching, and if Sci-Fi had a crashed ship somewhere, they needed to find it before the tribe did. But for now, just for a moment, they were alive. And that was enough. The jungle was quieter now, the distant drums of the Alari fading into the night. Darren sat near the edge of their small shelter, his survival knife resting on his lap. Sci-Fi lay beside him, curled in his jacket, her breathing slow and steady. She had finally fallen asleep. He watched her for a moment, the way her silver hair shimmered under the faint glow of the alien moon, the way her fingers clutched at the fabric of his jacket as if afraid it would disappear. Even in rest, there was a tension in her body, a quiet fear that hadn't left her since he found her. Darren sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't sure what the hell he was doing. Getting involved with an alien girl? Rescuing her from a death ritual? This wasn't part of the survival plan. And yet, he glanced down at her again, something warm stirring in his chest. She had been alone. Just like him. A faint rustle in the bushes made his instincts flare. He gripped his knife, scanning the trees. The jungle was full of predators, some with fangs, others with poison, all of them dangerous. But the noise wasn't from an animal. It was Sci-Fi. She shifted slightly, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Her brows furrowed, her body tensing. A nightmare. Darren hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hey," he murmured. "You're all right." She gasped, jolting awake, her violet eyes wide with panic. "Shoo," Darren whispered. "It's just me." Her breathing was fast, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. Then, realizing where she was, she exhaled shakily and pressed a hand to her forehead. I thought they had me again," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Darren frowned. "They won't. I won't let them." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for something in his expression. And whatever she saw, it must have been enough, because her body relaxed. Slowly, she sat up, the jacket slipping from her shoulders. The jungle air was still damp, still cool, and without thinking, Darren reached out, pulling the fabric back around her. Her fingers brushed against his. She stilled. So did he. The moment stretched, charged with something unspoken. Darren's heart thudded a little harder in his chest, but he didn't move away. Neither did she. "You're different," she whispered. He huffed a small, dry laugh. "Yeah, well, so are you." She smiled, just a little. "I mean it. The Ilari. The ones I've met before, they see weakness and attack. But you," her fingers tightened on the jacket. "You protect." Darren swallowed. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, he leaned back against the rock, staring up at the sky. "You said your ship crashed. Is it still in one piece?" She followed his gaze to the stars. "Mostly. The engine's dead, and my beacon was destroyed when I landed." Her voice dropped. "I don't think anyone's coming for me." Darren was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll fix it." She turned to him, eyes wide. "What?" "You heard me." He smirked. "I'm not exactly an engineer, but I know my way around tech. We can find parts, salvage what we need. Get you off this rock." Saiva blinked, as if struggling to believe it. Then, to his surprise, her eyes softened, shining with something vulnerable. "Darren," she murmured. "Why are you doing this?" He met her gaze, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. Then, without thinking, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of silver hair from her face. "Because you're not alone anymore," he said softly. Saiva inhaled sharply, her lips parting slightly. For a second, just a second, it felt like the whole jungle had gone silent, like the only thing that existed was the warmth between them. And then, a distant howl shattered the moment. Darren's muscles tensed. Saiva's fingers clutched his arm. The Ilari were still hunting. And they weren't far. Darren exhaled, forcing himself to focus. "We need to move at first light," he murmured. Saiva nodded, her grip on his sleeve lingering for a moment before she let go. "Get some rest," he told her. "I'll keep watch." She hesitated, then, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, she whispered, "Thank you." Darren didn't say anything. He just nodded. Because he already knew. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about her. Dawn broke through the dense jungle canopy, casting golden light over the damp earth. Darren stood at the edge of their makeshift shelter, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. The night had passed without another attack, but that didn't mean they were safe. Saiva stirred behind him, stretching as she sat up. Her silver hair caught the morning light, shimmering like stardust. Darren turned, and for a brief moment, his chest tightened at the sight of her. She was exhausted but still beautiful in a way that was difficult to explain, like something out of a dream. She caught him staring and tilted her head. "What?" Darren smirked. "Nothing. Just making sure you're still in one piece." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "I'm fine." "Good." He crouched, unrolling a rough map he had made from scraps of fabric and charcoal. "You said your ship's wreckage is northeast?" Saiva nodded, scooting closer. "Yes, but it's deep in Ilari territory. We'll have to be careful." Darren traced a path with his finger. "We can move through the old ruins here." It'll give us cover. He glanced at her. You good to walk? She gave him a determined look. I'm not slowing you down. He grinned. That's what I like to hear. With that, they set off. The jungle was alive with sound as they moved, birds with metallic feathers, insects that hummed like tiny engines. Darren led the way, keeping low, scanning every movement around them. Sci-Fi followed close, her steps lighter than his, her eyes sharp. He had to admit, she was quick, adapting to the terrain faster than he expected. After an hour of trekking, they reached the ruins, a series of broken stone structures overgrown with vines. Darren paused, pressing his back to a wall, signaling for Sci-Fi to do the same. Why are we stopping? She whispered. Darren pointed. Tracks, large ones. Sci-Fi inhaled sharply. Olari patrols. He nodded. They're close. A guttural voice rumbled in the distance, speaking in a language Darren didn't understand. Footstep. He turned to Sci-Fi, keeping his voice low. We wait until they pass. She nodded, pressing herself against the stone. Darren shifted, standing just close enough that their shoulders touched. Minutes stretched like hours. The Olari warriors passed through, their heavy weapons gleaming under the sun. Darren held his breath, feeling the tension in Sci-Fi's body beside him. Then, silence. The moment they were gone, Sci-Fi exhaled, leaning against the wall. That was close. Darren smirked. Told you I was good at this. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Cocky human. He winked. You love it. Her cheeks darkened slightly, but she didn't deny it. They moved quickly after that, weaving through the ruins until they reached a ridge. Below them, half buried in vines and dirt, was Sci-Fi's ship. Her breath caught. It's still here. Darren grinned. Then let's get to work. They climbed down, pushing through thick foliage until they reached the ship. It was sleek, made of a metal that seemed to shift colors under the light. But the damage was obvious. Gashes along the hull, exposed wiring, shattered panels. Sci-Fi ran her fingers over the surface. The power core is intact. But the engine is useless without a new igniter. Darren knelt, inspecting the damage. I might know where to find one. She looked at him, hopeful. You do? Yeah. There's an old human outpost about a day's trek from here. It was abandoned years ago, but if the generators are still there, we can salvage the parts. Sci-Fi's eyes gleamed. Then we have a chance. Darren stood, brushing dirt off his hands. A good one. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Darren. He turned, and before he could react, she placed a hand on his chest. I never thought I'd have hope again, she whispered. His breath hitched. The jungle, the mission, the danger, it all faded in that moment. Slowly, he lifted a hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're not alone, Sci-Fi. She exhaled, leaning into his touch. Neither are you. Darren swallowed. He had been alone for so long, surviving day by day, never expecting anything more. But now, with her, something had changed, and he wasn't going to let go. Darren and Sci-Fi moved fast. The jungle was still thick with danger, but with each step, their goal became clearer. The old human outpost lay to the east, its remains hidden beneath years of overgrowth. If they could salvage the parts they needed, Sci-Fi's ship might fly again. As they trekked through the dense terrain, Darren glanced at her. She was different now. Stronger. More determined. But there was something else too. Something in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Something that made his heart beat a little faster. They reached the outpost by midday. It was a skeleton of rusted metal and shattered glass, barely standing against the pull of time. Darren led the way through the wreckage, stepping over fallen beams and tangled wires. This place looks worse than I remember, he muttered. Sci-Fi smirked. And yet you're still confident we'll find what we need? He shot her a grin. Always. They searched through the remains, tossing aside debris, checking old supply crates. Then, finally, got it. Darren held up a cylindrical device, the igniter still intact. This should do it. Scifa took it from his hands, inspecting it with wide eyes. It's perfect. Darren grinned. Then let's get back in. A sound stopped him cold. Drums. Sciva's grip on the igniter tightened. The Yolari. Darren's jaw clenched. They must have tracked us. Through the broken walls of the outpost, movement flickered in the trees, shadows shifting, bodies closing in. We can't outrun them this time, Sciva whispered. Darren tightened his hold on his knife. Then we fight. Sciva met his gaze, something fierce in her violet eyes. Together. The Yolari struck fast, their war cries shaking the air. Darren ducked under a swinging blade, driving his knife into the attacker's side. Sciva moved like lightning, her slender frame twisting as she dodged and countered, using her alien strength to knock a warrior to the ground. They fought back to back, cutting through the waves of enemies. Darren's muscles burned, his breath ragged, but he refused to fall. Not now. Not with her at his side. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the battle shifted. A deep, guttural horn sounded through the jungle. The Yolari warriors hesitated, then retreated into the shadows, their glowing eyes lingering before vanishing into the trees. Silence. Darren wiped blood from his arm, panting. What the hell just happened? Sciva swallowed hard. They stopped. He frowned. Why? She turned to him, eyes wide. Because they see us differently now. Darren raised an eyebrow. How differently? Sciva stepped closer, her breathing still uneven. In their culture, those who fight together in battle are bound. Darren blinked. Bound. As in bonded. Her voice softened. Like mates. He stared at her, heart pounding. Wait. You're saying? Sciva bit her lip. To them, we're not just allies. They think we belong to each other. Darren let out a breathless chuckle. Well, do we? She hesitated, but then, instead of answering with words, she reached up and cupped his face in her hands. Her touch was warm, grounding, and when she leaned in, Darren didn't move away. Her lips brushed his, soft at first, then deeper, as if sealing something unspoken between them. When she pulled back, she whispered, I don't want to leave without you. Darren exhaled, his hands resting on her waist. Then don't. A choice lay before them, fix the ship and leave or stay together on this strange world, where they had become more than just survivors. Sciva smiled softly. Wherever we go together? Darren grinned. Together. And as the jungle whispered around them, and the Yolari watched from the shadows, they knew this was only the beginning.